here. Electric mobility is something that is pretty close to my heart, not just for the fact that I work with Tesla. And I know the conversations have been happening, and it's been sounding like a bit of a pipe dream, but I'm so glad to see this happening now, and we're definitely starting to get momentum in what we need to do. So my presentation really is more of a scene setter for the conversations that are going to be happening for the rest of the day. And I will be looking through innovations, the whole theme around innovations that will drive sustainable e-mobility solutions. And we have to start with a word from my sponsor, who is Tesla. So our mission really is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. Why? Because we believe that, let me just track back a little bit and say that about 22% of CO2 emissions, global CO2 emissions, actually are attributed to transportation. And we believe that if we could do something about that, would definitely help make life more sustainable. So we have products across both transportation and energy. Energy is the other big emitter of CO2 gas, about 27%. So we believe that we are tackling roughly, 50–60% of the culprits when it comes to pollution. We believe that burning fossil fuels to move is actually a really bad idea. Not only is it destructive on the environment, but it's also relatively, very inefficient rather, because less than 30% of the energy content, of fuel actually translates into motion in vehicles. But when you compare that with close to 90% on electric vehicles, then you see that actually going to electric vehicles is actually a really smart way to move. So Tesla, we have two divisions: the energy side and the vehicle side. Although I'm more on the energy side, I will be speaking a little bit more towards EVs and mobility. What cuts across all our product suite is energy storage, which is batteries, and batteries are really what have enabled electric transportation to really take hold, as we will see in the next couple of slides. Sustainability. So that's the ability to be maintained at a certain level of rate. So the current momentum for electrification of mobility, just fuels a lot of hope. But this is not the first time around we're doing this. So electric cars have failed before, and they failed spectacularly. I think the first electric vehicle really showed up around 1832, and there was a lot of issues. There was a race between internal combustion engines and electric vehicles in trying to get dominance. And we can see that Porsche actually had invented an electric car as early as 1901. But then, if you look at it, innovation actually is what actually drove electric vehicles out of the market. And the first innovation that did that was actually mass production. So Ford Motors managed to blow away electric vehicles with the Model T, with mass production. Then transportation of gas. There were innovations around that built that so that gas stations were available all over the rural US, whereas electricity wasn't, because you needed to build transmission and distribution lines, but yet you just needed to put gas on a tank and put it somewhere in a pump. So as a result of widespread availability of gas and mass production, which drove down prices of cars, then electric vehicles just went into decline. And I think since just about the 1930s, we didn't see much more of any electric vehicles being produced. And I think the lesson for us there is that for e-mobility to be sustainable, this innovation has to be supported by the system. It has to spawn off sort of like innovation in social models, in business models. And we'll kind of explore a few of those themes going forward. So over the last 50 or so years, there's been several efforts to really revive electric mobility. Some very interesting, but I think the common theme that always that always drove these factors or these efforts to be unsustainable was that it was all dependent on gas prices. So as long as gas prices rose, we flirted around with electric mobility. But when the situation went back to normal, then that was quickly forgotten. Never mind that technology also wasn't very good then. Batteries were very bulky. These cars had ranges of less than 50, 60 kilometers. So range anxiety was a really big issue. So interest in electric cars faded pretty quickly. And I think before the current wave, the last really successful or really exciting EV attempt was by GM. So in 1996, GM had the EV1. Which was a really great vehicle. And I think, so this was an all-electric vehicle that was designed to meet the zero emissions mandate by the state of California. It used some very interesting technologies such as low resistance tires, which were designed to reduce energy loss, and was the first one to actually deploy induction charging. And this car was very popular and so many were sold. But the product cost was high. The leasing policies were rigid. You couldn't buy it. You couldn't buy it. You had to lease it from GM. The charging infrastructure was a bit, defective. So there were many times that you actually wanted to charge and you couldn't really charge your car. And in the end, what GM did was to recall all these cars and crash most of them. And the ones that remain in museums, they took out the drivetrains. And really, what you can find today is really just a shell of that. And in 2006, Tesla came up with the first luxury electric vehicle. And even then, it wasn't so sure, the world wasn't so sure that this was going to be sustainable. And it was dismissed because it was pretty much a Lotus Elise body, and then the drivetrain was stripped out and replaced with an electric drivetrain. And it was a very expensive car, costing $200,000 and above. It was a niche car, and again, the same story was, this is unsustainable, it's for the super rich, it will never work. But have we cracked sustainability of e-mobility? I think there's great momentum in that direction. I think we saw in 1997 the Toyota Prius really becoming the first mass adopted hybrid vehicle, and it's still in the market today. Scientists have been building better batteries ever since then. Tesla launched the sports car in 2006 and has gone on to launch many more models after that. Initially, Tesla had to literally develop a countrywide charging infrastructure just to make it possible for people to use electric cars. What we are seeing now is dozens, if not hundreds, of third-party companies that are actually investing in charging infrastructure products. So that means, getting fast to market, route to market for electric vehicles is getting a lot easier. We don't have manufacturers don't have to build their own charging infrastructure. And I know there are questions around that because I think we come back to the whole Apple versus Android discussion, when it comes to charging. When are we going to see a universal sort of like charging protocol and standard that allows all EVs to actually use the same infrastructure? But I think those are issues that are going to be addressed. In 2010, Chevrolet released the Volt, which actually became a very successful plug-in hybrid, and which was and in 2010 also we also saw the Nissan Leaf launched. I think we do have a couple of Nissan Leafs in Kenya, so it's not a a foreign concept. The reality is here we do have these cars available. So again, it's important to stress that for this innovation to be sustainable, the system has to take in this innovation. But unfortunately, we know that the system will probably fend off the innovation. There will be resistance to that. But I think there's still hope, because I think when an idea whose time has come, is there, then the disruption can be sustained. And when you talk about the system, Right now, we do have building blocks that are going to sustain innovation that will help us sort of gain that change or momentum against the current reality. And I wouldn't even talk about a lot of the resistance that electric mobility faces from traditional fuel marketers, from traditional automobile manufacturers, from the oil producers and the likes. But when I look at it here, I see there's a lot of push and momentum. If you look at the 22% or so of CO2 emissions by economic sector, transportation being 22%, of that, between heavy goods transportation and personal mobility, we can tackle about 76% of those CO2 emissions. I think that's a pretty good number for us to sort of work with. And I don't know if most of you noticed some really big news that came out a couple of weeks ago, that for the first time in like decades, CO2 emissions from industries did not rise last year. And I think that's some of the best news that we could actually hope for from a sustainability perspective. So it's time for us to actually do our part in actually making sure that CO2 emissions from transportation do not rise, but actually decrease. Out of about 20 or so million vehicles that are sold every year globally, less than 500,000 of those are electric at the moment. So it's still a very small dot in terms of progress towards e-mobility, but the momentum is currently happening. Batteries. The battery is the single most expensive element in an electric vehicle. I think easily you could actually say the battery would account for about $20,000 to $30,000 on an electric vehicle. That's a huge component. There are brand new vehicles actually on the market for less than that. But costs have been dropping. I think we've seen costs drop down by more than 40%, 50% in the last 4 years, and they continue to drop, and that gives us a lot of hope. There's a lot of choice. Never before have consumers had so much more choice when it comes to EVs. There's over 60 models now out there that are available, 60 individual models, a mix between full electric and hybrid vehicles. And range is improving. As you'll see from numbers from Bloomberg there, I think you're coming in from the Tesla Model 3 with a range price per mile of about $140 for the battery, all the way to the most expensive at the moment, which is the Mercedes-Benz B250e at about 3 times as much. So there's a lot of choice, there's a lot of innovation that is actually driving that sustainability. And I think e-mobility cannot be sustainable without technology, and there's a lot of innovation in technology. I think the vehicles themselves are able to pack on so many electronics and sensors that it is actually possible to envisage a future where you actually do not need to own a car yourself. Between communication, between apps that come up, I'll give an example of the Tesla app. So once you put up a route of where you want to go, it actually shows you how much range you have and all the recharging options and how much time you'll need to stop everywhere or if you need to stop at all to recharge. I think that's great innovation. It kind of removes that anxiety of, am I going to get to Mombasa on a single charge? But if you had a route and it was planned out and you knew exactly where you will need to stop and how long you need to stop, and you can plan around that, I think that's actually amazing. And with the advent of fast charging, supercharging, which gets you up to from 0 to 80% of the battery capacity in 20 minutes, which is very comparable to the time you actually stop in to a gas station if you're on empty, and fill up your car and pay for it and pay for the gas. I think that gap has narrowed down significantly. So in terms of convenience, EVs are actually just getting up there and can compete with internal combustion engine vehicles. And I think if we look at the transformative capacity or capability of e-mobility, new business models have been emerging around that. So whether it's car sharing, whether it's autonomous driving. I saw a very interesting app called Spark, where you actually do not need to own a car, and you have a range of cars that you can choose to hire straight off your app, and you have a wide selection, and all these are electric vehicles. And with autonomous driving, the future will mean that you actually don't need to go to where the car rental lot is. The car can actually come to you. Yeah? And the car can actually do so many things. It come for you, drop your kids to school, come back, take you to work, and go back and do, get some shopping done, and somebody else gets to use the car, and then you can call for the car later on and do your thing. Locally, I think we have seen some very interesting innovations and new business models that are starting to emerge. Opibus, converting Safari Land Cruisers into electric. I think that's great. That just goes to show you that there is potential and there's willingness to actually take up e-mobility, not pure ride, on ride hailing. I think that has been a great success so far. I think they've really been a proof of concept for us who are doubters about electric mobility. And we've seen several homegrown ride-hailing apps from Little, Kabi, and a couple of others. Taxify, Mondo, Sandy, Uber is here, and everything. So this is actually very exciting. So I can confidently say that in terms of new business models that will sustain e-mobility, the building blocks are in place. In terms of social innovation, we still have a long way to go. I think Kenya is a country we are addicted to cars, and car ownership is a status symbol, and that will need to change. No, I think owning a car will soon become a very dumb thing to do, because when you look at it today, over the lifetime of the car, you actually use your car literally for less than 20% of its lifetime. The rest of the time it's sitting somewhere in the parking lot waiting for you to move. So with e-mobility, with autonomous mobility, with ride sharing, car sharing, the choice we've seen, we have more than 60 models now available. The choice of vehicles that will be available with e-mobility innovation, that should really drive social transformation, and we change how we think about cars and how we need to own cars, or rather how we need not to own vehicles going forward. But for this transformation to be sustainable, we still have to overcome a bit of inertia in the system. I think as a country, we're still addicted to petroleum. According to the OECD, Kenya's imports in the last year were about $17 billion. Of that $17 billion, 14% was petroleum. 14% of our imports last year were petroleum. And out of that petroleum import number, about 68% of that was in transportation. So that's between the retail outlets, the Totals, the Shells that you see, and bulk fuel sales. So when you look at that, there's been a lot of noise in the country around the introduction of VAT on petroleum, which happened 2 years back, which suggests that the government probably has targets of a couple of, in the range of 30, 50 billion shillings in VAT alone on petroleum. So if we are to move to electric mobility, how are we going to fill that revenue gap at the exchequer? So I think interesting conversations need to be had, around there. If you look at our oil market, between the main majors, Vivo, Total, Rubis, Ola, these guys are controlling 50% plus of the market. What are they going to be doing should we move towards an electric mobility future? I wouldn't even talk about the kind of tussle that we are seeing at the moment with Swivel and the NTSA. We saw the resistance that happened a couple of years back when ride-hailing was introduced. I think the overall message there is that the system is resistant to change. So it places a lot of onus and imperative to make sure that e-mobility innovations and how we introduce e-mobility in the country is very well thought about. The country, the various players are actually, should be well prepared for that transition. It should be very deliberate. And the emerging themes for me here are regulation. What incentives do we need to give to existing players to make the migration? Consumer education, so that we can actually reap maximum benefit from electric mobility. And protection, of some sort. I wouldn't call it really protection, but a framework that allows existing stakeholders and players to transition to an e-mobility future where they also succeed, and it's a win-win for all of us. Thank you so much. That's the end of my presentation.